Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: "It is better to fail in originality than to succeed in imitation." From the American novelist, short story writer and poet Herman Melville. A brief review of the last part, where we concluded our study of Chapter 2, The Double Pawn and Restraint, Part 2 of the book, Position Play, and went through games number 34 and 35 of the illustrative game section as advised by Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further in the book, we begin the next chapter, The Isolated Queen's Pawn and Their Descendants, which is chapter 3 of the second part of the book, Position Play. Nimzowitsch begins the chapter with the topic number 1, Introductory, and writes, "The problem of the isolated queen's pawn or d-pawn is, in my opinion, one of the cardinal or fundamental problems in the whole theory of position play. We are concerned with the appraisal of a statically weak pawn, who, however, notwithstanding their weakness, is imbued with dynamic strength. Which preponderates or is more important, the static weakness or the dynamic strength? So put, the problem gains in significance. In fact, it strays in a sense beyond the circumscribed or drawn boundaries of chess. It is indispensable that the student should face this problem themselves, that is to say, have a personal experience of it. They should try as white to get the so-called normal position in the queen's gambit. d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, e3, c5, knight c3, knight c6, and then alternately in one game, bishop d3, c takes on d4, e takes on d4, d takes on c4, bishop takes on c4, and white has an ISOLANI. In the other, c takes on d5 instead of bishop d3, e takes on d5, d takes on c5, bishop takes on c5, and now white has to fight against the ISOLANI. It will do them good to realize in their own person how dangerous an enemy ISOLANI may be, and how difficult it is to save their own from an untimely end. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses the next topic, number 2, the dynamic strength of the isolated d-pawn. Nimzowitsch writes, "The strength of an ISOLANI, see the position on board, lies in its lust to expand, equals to the tendency d5. And in addition to the circumstance that this pawn protects, indeed creates the white outpost stations at e5 and c5. As opposed to this, the black outpost station at d5 has not, at any rate in the middle game, the full equivalent value, or quite apart from any arithmetical preponderance or majority, that is 2 outposts to 1, white can point to the fact that a knight at e5 in the position on board must have a sharper effect than is ever possible to an opposing knight at d5. For it is clear that a knight at e5, seconded by 2 powerful bishop diagonals, d3 to h7 and g5 to f6 must exert pressure on black's king's wing. And what can be sharper than an attack on the king? The linear investigation yields therefore an undoubted plus to the first or white player. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside its diagram as follows. The isolated d-pawn. Notice white's outpost station at e5 and black's at d5. Nimzowitsch continues. On the other hand, our pawn, as is well known, tends to become a weakness in the ending. How are we to understand this? Is the difficulty only this, that the pawn at d4 is hard to defend, or are there other calamities in store? Nimzowitsch moves on here to the next topic, number 3, the ISOLANI as an endgame weakness. Nimzowitsch writes, our judgment on the problem which we have sketched must be influenced by the circumstance that to the points e5 for white and d5 for black, a different valuation must be assigned in the endgame than was the case in the middle game. For in the ending, attacks on the king are not in question, and so white's e5 loses much of its glory, while black's d5 gains in importance. And if white has not already got through to c7 or lacks other trump cards earned in the middle game to point 2, their position will not be particularly enviable. White will suffer not only under the want of protection felt by their ISOLANI, but also from the fact that the white or light squares such as d4, c4 and e4 can easily become weak. Consider the position on board. Black, by a check with the knight, drives the white king from c4, plays then king d5 and pushes further forward with their king via c4 or e4. In every pertinent case that may arise, d5 must be regarded as the key point of black's position. With this point as base, black will blockade, centralize and maneuver. d5 will provide a gate of entry into the enemy position and also a point of junction in all possible troop movements. For instance, consider the position on board with the presence of rooks and knights. In the case of a black's rook d8 to d5 to a5, or knight f6 to d5 to b4, or finally knight d5 to e7 to f5 and takes on a d4. A black knight posted at d5 exercises an impressive effect on both wings. A bishop at d5 not seldom forces a decision even with bishops on opposite colors. For example, if there be rooks remaining on each side. Obviously, white may have counterbalancing or even apparently preponderating compensation for these trumps of blacks. For instance, should one of white's rooks have penetrated to c7, but such cases can only be considered as exceptions to the rule. To recapitulate, white's weakness in the endgame rests on the fact that their pawn on d4 seems to be threatened, while d5 is extraordinarily strong for black. Further, that the light squares c4, d5 and e4 tend to become weak, whereas much of the one-time importance of e5 is spent. White's pawn position was in fact not compact, and other disadvantages to which we have called attention, such as a weakness pervading a complex of squares on a given color, must necessarily attach themselves to a pawn position which is not compact or which is broken up. We earnestly recommend to the student as extremely profitable that they sharpen their sense for compact positions and reverse. The student must also bear carefully in mind that it is not only the ISOLANI itself that tends to become a weakness, but also the complex of squares surrounding it. In this, the principal evil is to be found. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses the next topic under the heading number 4, the ISOLANI as a weapon of attack in the middle game. Nimzowitsch writes, solidity of construction and purpose should at first sign of neglect on the part of the opponent, for example, if they have withdrawn their pieces from the king's wing, give place to a violent attack. Many players with an ISOLANI proceed much too violently, but it seems to me that there is no objective motive for plunging into a desperate attack. At first, the utmost solidity is called for. The attack will come of itself in good time. For instance, when black has withdrawn their knight at f6, which they will at some time naturally do, since the knight wants to get to d5. In the development stage, see the position on board again. We would therefore recommend the solid construction bishop at e3, not g5, queen at e2, rooks c1 and d1, not d1 and e1. Further, bishop at d3 or b1, not b3. And the first or white player cannot be too strongly warned against attempting surprise attacks in the early stages, started by perhaps knight to e5 takes on f7, a bishop being at a2, or by a rook sally, rook to e1 to e3 to h3. A solid position aimed at maintaining the security of the pawn at d4 is the one and only right course, and it must ever be remembered that the bishop at e3 belongs to the pawn at d4 as does a nurse to a suckling child. It is only when black has withdrawn their pieces from the king's side that white may sound the attack, and this, if they will, white may carry out in sacrificial style. Consider the position on board. White has developed their pieces in the spirit of this section, and the text move, knight e8, gives them the chance which, as in all similar cases, white avidly seizes to launch a direct attack on the enemy king. The result in the present case is doubtful, But since the whole manner of conducting the attack is characteristic of ISOLANI positions, we give a few variations. Knight e8, queen h5 and g6. If f5, then bishop g5. So g6, queen h6 and knight g7, or f6 and knight g4. So knight g7 and bishop g5. The pieces now come out of their reserve. f6, bishop takes on g6, h takes on g6, knight takes on g6. And now two variations arise according as the white queen retreats to d7 or d6. In the former, if the former or queen d7, white has two courses open to them, either bishop h4 or the more combinational bishop takes on f6, knight takes on f6, queen h8 check, king f7, knight e5 check, king e8, knight takes on d7, rook takes on h8 and knight takes on f6 check, with 3 pawns for the piece sacrificed. If black plays queen d6 instead of queen d7, white can carry on with queen h8 check, king f7, queen f7, f takes on g5, knight e5 check, and the continuation could be king e8, queen takes on g7, queen e7, queen g6 check, king d8 and rook c6 with wild complications. So once more, build up a solid position, support the ISOLANI, bishop e3, and only attack when opportunity really offers. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside its diagram in the book as follows. Black with the move played knight e8 to get to d6. This is the trumpet call for the attack for white. How will the attack be started and what will be its course? Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses the next topic under the heading number 5, which cases are favorable for white and which for black. Nimzowitsch writes, in general, it may be said that the two following cases are worth striving for by white. Number 1, when white has affected d5, e takes on d5, a white piece takes on a d5 and thereby gets the better because a centralized position, as in the game Rubinstein versus Tartakova at Baden-Baden 1925. Number 2, when white has built up a position in the C file, reference game number 36 of the illustrative game section, Nimzowitsch versus Taubenhaus. For black, the following are desirable. Number 1, all cases ceteris paribus, or with other conditions remaining the same, of a pronounced endgame character. Number 2, those where black has played knight on a d5, takes knight on a c3, and b takes on c3, with the idea of pinning down white's pawn at c3 from the start and laying siege to it. Reference game number 11 of the illustrative game section, Thomas versus Alekhine, and see topic number 7 further in this chapter on the isolated pawn couple. Please note that we will go through game number 11, Thomas versus Alekhine, at the end of this video series, along with any other remaining games from the illustrative game section of the book. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses the next topic under the heading number 6 on the possible genesis or origins of reflex weaknesses among the queenside pawns of the player with an ISOLANI. Nimzowitsch writes, an index of the weakness of the ISOLANI appears in the possibility, which is not seldom offered to the opponent, of transferring their attack from the d pawn to the queen's wing. Such a case of reflex weakness may be seen in game number 23, Rubinstein versus Duras. Please note that this game was covered in part 30 of this video series. Nimzowitsch continues. A similar picture is presented in the following game, Rubinstein versus Dr. Lasker, Moscow, 1925. After the moves d4, d5, c4, c6, e3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, knight f3, knight d7, bishop d3, d takes on c4, bishop takes on c4, b5, bishop e2, a6, castling, bishop b7, b3, bishop e7, bishop b2, castling, knight e5, c5, bishop f3, queen c7, knight takes on d7, knight takes on d7, knight e4, rook d8, rook c1, queen b8, queen e2, c takes on d4, e takes on d4, rook c8, g3, queen a8, king g2, rook d8, rook takes on c8, rook takes on c8, rook c1, rook takes on c1, bishop takes on c1, and h6. Black took a strategically most interesting advantage of the weakness of white's pawn at d4. The continuation was bishop b2, knight b6, and h3, since he wants to avoid the exchange of queens. Queen c2 and queen c8 would be of no use. Queen c8, queen d3, and knight d5, threatening knight b4. a3 and knight b6, double exclamation mark. Now white's b pawn has become weak. King h2, bishop d5, king g2, queen c6, knight d2, a5, and queen c3. In his trouble, he decides after all to submit to the exchange of queens, but succumbs to the reflex weaknesses which have now arisen. Bishop takes on f3 check, and knight takes on f3. Queen takes on f3 would fail because of queen c2, queen b7, and knight d5. So knight takes on f3, queen takes on c3, bishop takes on c3, and a4. And now the weakness of white's queenside is evident. B takes on a4, b takes on a4, and white lost, since the attempt to save himself by bishop b4 failed against bishop takes on b4, a takes on b4, a3, knight d2, and now knight d5, whereby the approach of the white king via e2, d3 and c4 is prevented. The answer to king e2 after b5 would always be knight c3 check. What is remarkable in this fine ending, in addition to the transference of the attack, is the masterly and varied use made of the point d5. On the manner of laying siege to an isolani, I would make this additional remark that today we no longer consider it necessary to render an enemy isolani absolutely immobile. On the contrary, we like to give them the illusion of freedom rather than shut them up in a cage. The principle of the large zoological garden applied to the small beast of prey. How this is done is shown in the following game. Lasker, whom we class under the moderns, versus Tarrasch, St. Petersburg, 1914. d4, d5, knight f3, c5, c4, e6, c takes on d5, e takes on d5, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, knight f6, castling, bishop e7, d takes on c5, bishop takes on c5, knight d2. And now the isolani has the choice whether they will become weak on d5 or d4. Tarrasch chose the latter, and there followed d4. Knight b3, knight b6, bishop b6, queen d3, bishop e6, rook d1, bishop takes on b3, queen takes on b3, queen e7, bishop d2, castling, a4, knight e4, bishop e1, rook d8, a5, double exclamation mark, bishop c5, a6, and b takes on a6. If b6, then queen a4, threatening b4 in addition to queen takes on c6. So b takes on a6 and rook c1, and now all the pieces defending the pawn at d4 are in the air. There followed rook c8, knight h4, bishop b6, knight f7, queen e5, bishop takes on e4, queen takes on e4, and knight d6, winning the exchange. Taking everything into consideration, the isolani is not an ineffective weapon in the middle game, but it can become very weak in the ending. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system here, and we shall continue onwards from the next one. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. A couple of new supporters, kingmarcher and Alexander Roy 1. Thank you for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.